I stared into my rearview mirror, watching a 2-ton SUV rev its engine like it was staging for a drag race, all while an 85-year-old woman with silver hair and shaking hands was halfway out of my van. How does 30 seconds of patience become a death wish on the pavement? I've seen a lot on the road. Angry commuters, reckless teenagers, people who treat stop signs like suggestions. But I never expected a routine drop-off at a dementia center to turn into a high-stakes game of chicken that almost cost someone their life. You have to wonder what goes through a person's mind when they decide that their schedule is worth more than the safety of someone who can barely remember their own name. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. And honestly, the more I think about it, the more I realize that some people aren't just in a hurry. They're missing a piece of their humanity. You know, people always ask me if I get bored behind the wheel all day. They see the van, they see the slow pace, and they assume it's a mindless job. But there's a specific kind of quiet that lives inside a medical transport van. It's a heavy quiet, filled with the weight of decades of memories that are slowly flickering out like a dying light bulb. My job mostly consists of driving elderly people to various appointments, doctors, physical therapy, grocery stores. But the one that sticks with me the most is the adult day program for people living with Alzheimer's and dementia. Every morning, I start my shift when the sun is barely kissing the horizon. I check my fluids, I make sure the lift is greased and silent, and I head out into a world that's usually too busy to notice us. To the rest of the world, we're just a slow-moving obstacle in the right lane. But inside that van, I'm the guardian of someone's grandmother, someone's father, someone's entire history. You learn to drive differently when you have that responsibility. You don't take corners sharp. You don't slam on the brakes. You become an extension of the vehicle, trying to make the world feel as smooth as possible for people whose lives have become incredibly jagged and confusing. On the day this happened, I was transporting a regular client of mine. Let's call her Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable is one of those tiny, bird-like women who always smells faintly of peppermint and old-fashioned talcum powder. She's sweet, but she's fragile. Some days she knows exactly where we're going, and she'll tell me stories about the garden she used to keep in the 70s. Other days, she just stares out the window with a look of profound loss, as if she's looking for a home that doesn't exist anymore. On this particular morning, she was having a foggy day. She was hesitant, her movements were slow, and she kept clutching her small handbag like it was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. Now you have to understand the layout of this day program. It's a beautiful facility, full of caring staff and bright rooms, but the person who designed the entryway must have had a personal vendetta against drivers. It's a logistical nightmare. The driveway is narrow, lined with high curbs and decorative landscaping that leaves absolutely zero room for error. There is a normal drop-off spot right by the front door, but it only fits one vehicle. If someone is already there, you're stuck. There's a tiny secondary area by the curb just behind it, but using it means you're effectively blocking the exit of the first spot for as long as it takes to get your passenger out. I've been bringing clients here for months. Usually, it's a dance of mutual respect. Most drivers see the lift, they see the white hair, and they give a little wave or a nod. They know the drill. It takes maybe 20 to 30 seconds to get someone out safely. In the grand scheme of a human life, 30 seconds is nothing. It's a deep breath. It's a moment to check your phone or adjust your mirrors. But for some people, 30 seconds is an insult. As I pulled into the facility that morning, I saw that the main spot was taken. No big deal. I did what I always do. I pulled into that smaller secondary spot, clicked on my hazard lights, and shifted into park. I could see the driver in the main spot, a woman in a late model SUV. She was just sitting there, presumably finished with her own drop-off, but not yet moving. I didn't think twice about it. I hopped out of the driver's seat, walked around to the side, and began the process of getting Mrs. Gable out. I want you to picture this. The air was cool, the birds were chirping in the trees surrounding the center, and Mrs. Gable was slowly, carefully unbuckling her seatbelt. I opened the side door and engaged the hydraulic ramp. It's not a fast process. It's a mechanical hum, a slow, steady whir clunk, as the metal folds out and finds its footing on the pavement. I reached in to take Mrs. Gable's hand. She looked at me with those wide, uncertain eyes, and I gave her a reassuring smile. "Take your time, Mrs. Gable," I said softly. "The ground is right there, just one step at a time." She nodded, her hand trembling slightly in mine. We were halfway through the transition. Her left foot was reaching for the ramp, her weight shifting precariously. This is the moment of maximum vulnerability. If she falls here, it's a broken hip. It's a hospital stay. It's the beginning of the end for someone her age. And that's when I heard it. The sound of an engine revving. Not just a gentle idle, but a frustrated, aggressive vroom that cut through the morning quiet like a chainsaw. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart skipped a beat. The woman in the SUV hadn't just started her car. She had lurched forward. She pulled up until her bumper was inches from my van's side, right where the ramp was deployed. She didn't wait. She didn't look at the elderly woman struggling to find her footing. Instead, she slammed on her brakes so hard the front of her car dipped, and then she threw her hands up in the air. It was the most exaggerated, theatrical, "What are you doing?" gesture I have ever seen in my life. Her face was contorted in this mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I was stunned. I was literally holding the hand of a woman who didn't know what year it was, trying to keep her from collapsing on the asphalt. And this person was acting like I had personally insulted her entire lineage by existing in her peripheral vision for 20 seconds. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I just pointed. I gestured toward Mrs. Gable, who was now looking at the SUV with a look of sheer terror. The noise, the sudden movement, it was too much for her. She froze. "It's okay," I whispered to her, though my own blood was starting to boil. Just a few more steps. The woman in the SUV wasn't finished. She wasn't just annoyed. She was vibrating with a kind of manic impatience that felt dangerous. She looked at the curb, a high, concrete barrier designed to protect the flower beds, and for a second, I genuinely thought she was going to try and drive over it just to get around us. She inched the car forward, the tires screeching against the pavement. Then, she realized she'd probably rip her oil pan out if she tried it. She slammed the car into reverse, the backup lights flashing like a warning signal. All of this was happening in a blur of motion while I was trying to remain a pillar of calm for Mrs. Gable. I got her onto the sidewalk, her feet finally hitting the solid ground, and I quickly ushered her toward the staff member who was waiting at the door. But as I turned back to retract my ramp, I realized the situation wasn't cooling down. It was escalating. The woman in the SUV was backing up at a speed that was completely inappropriate for a parking lot filled with elderly pedestrians. I felt a surge of genuine panic. I thought, this is it. She's lost it. She's going to ram the van. My heart was hammering against my ribs. That rhythmic thrumming you only get when your fight or flight response is screaming at you to move. I wasn't just worried about my van. I was worried about the 3 other people currently sitting inside, and the fragile woman I had just helped onto the curb. I scrambled back to the side door, my fingers fumbling for the switch to retract the ramp. If you've never operated a commercial wheelchair lift, let me tell you, it feels like the slowest machine on the planet when you're under pressure. Whir. Clunk. Whir. Every second that the metal stayed extended felt like an invitation for disaster. I looked over my shoulder, and there she was. The woman in the SUV hadn't just backed up, she had whipped her vehicle around with a screech of tires that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. Her face was a shade of red I didn't think was biologically possible. Her knuckles were white, gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought the plastic might snap. Through the windshield, I could see her shouting something, her mouth moving in jagged, angry bursts, though I couldn't hear the words through the glass. I didn't need to hear them to know the sentiment. Finally, the ramp tucked itself away, and the heavy sliding door began its slow, motorized crawl to close. I didn't wait for it to latch completely before I was diving into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I threw the van into gear. I wanted to get away from her. I wanted to put distance between my passengers and whatever explosion of rage was happening inside that SUV. As I started to pull away, moving at the responsible 5-mile-per-hour limit of the facility's parking lot, I saw her in my side mirror. She didn't just follow me, she launched. It was like she had been shot out of a cannon. She hammered the gas, the engine of her SUV roaring in a way that felt entirely out of place for a parking lot meant for the elderly and infirm. She didn't care about the posted signs. She didn't care about the visibility. She swung her vehicle out into the oncoming lane, the lane meant for people entering the facility, just to get around me. There's a massive speed bump right at the exit of the drop-off loop. It's one of those aggressive, yellow and black striped humps designed to force people to slow down to a crawl. I watched almost in slow motion as she hit it. She didn't even tap her brakes. The front of her SUV slammed into the bump at 25 or 30 miles per hour, and the whole vehicle bucked like a bronco. I could see her inside, her head snapping back and forth, her body rocking comically in the driver's seat as the suspension groaned under the impact. It was a moment of pure, unbridled absurdity. She was willing to destroy her own car's alignment just to save 3 seconds of time. She landed with a heavy thud on the other side, the underside of her car scraping against the asphalt with a metallic screech, but she didn't slow down. She kept the pedal pinned. I watched as she sped toward the exit. There's a stop sign there, a big red octagon that's supposed to protect the flow of traffic on the main road. She treated it like a suggestion. She did what I call a half run. She slowed down just enough to realize there was a car coming, then she swerved left, cutting off a sedan that had the right-of-way. The sedan honked, a long, mournful blast, and for a second, I thought there was going to be a collision right there. But she wasn't done. She was driving like someone in a high-speed chase, weaving through the morning traffic with a level of aggression that made my stomach turn. I saw her attempt another insane pass on a car in front of her, trying to whip around them on a narrow 2-lane road, before she realized there was a truck coming from the other direction. She jerked back into her lane at the last possible second, her car swaying dangerously. I sat there for a moment, my van idling near the exit, just watching the taillights of her SUV disappear into the distance. My hands were still gripped tight on the steering wheel. I could feel the sweat on my palms. Behind me, one of my other passengers, a man named Mr. Henderson, who usually stays pretty quiet, let out a long, shaky breath. "She was in an awful big hurry, wasn't she, son?" he asked, his voice thin and trembling. "Yeah, Mr. Henderson," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "She sure was." But hurry didn't feel like the right word. Hurry is when you're late for a job interview. Hurry is when you forgot to turn the stove off. This was something else. This was a complete breakdown of the social contract. As I drove toward our next stop, I couldn't stop thinking about the contrast of that morning. In the back of my van, I had people whose lives were defined by a slow, agonizing loss of control. Mrs. Gable can't control her memories. Mr. Henderson can't control his tremors. They have been forced by time and biology to slow down, to rely on the kindness and patience of others just to move from a seat to a sidewalk. Their entire existence is a lesson in patience. And then there was this woman. She had everything. She had her health, she had a functioning brain, she had a high-end vehicle, and she had the ability to go anywhere she wanted. And yet, she was so consumed by the minor inconvenience of a 30-second wait that she was willing to risk her life, my life, and the lives of the people I protect. It made me wonder, what does a person have to go through to get to that point? Is it a million small frustrations that finally boiled over? Or is there something fundamentally broken in how we treat each other when we're behind a steering wheel? To her, I wasn't a human being doing a difficult job. I wasn't a person helping a vulnerable grandmother. I was just a thing in her way. I was a delay on a GPS screen. I've seen road rage before. I've seen people scream and shout, but there was something about the location, the front door of a dementia center, that made this feel like a new low. It was a place where empathy should be the default setting. It was a place where everyone there was dealing with something heavy. I spent the rest of my morning in a sort of daze. I went through the motions, the pickups, the drop-offs, the careful securing of wheelchairs, but my mind kept going back to those 30 seconds. I kept replaying the look on her face. It wasn't just anger. It was a total lack of recognition that the people around her were real. By the time I pulled back into the depot for my lunch break, I was exhausted. Not the kind of exhaustion you get from physical labor, but the kind that comes from carrying the weight of someone else's toxicity. I sat in my van, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I just looked at the empty passenger seats. I realized then that my job isn't just about driving. It's about being a buffer. I am the thin line between the fragile people I carry and a world that seems to be getting faster, meaner, and more impatient by the day. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the image of that SUV bucking over the speed bump. I had more pickups to do. More people like Mrs. Gable who needed a steady hand and a patient heart. I couldn't let one woman's rage ruin the care I provided to the people who actually deserved it. But as I put the van back into gear, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of dread. If 30 seconds is enough to push someone over the edge, what happens when things actually get difficult? The rest of that afternoon felt like I was driving through a thick, invisible fog. It wasn't the weather. The sun was actually out, mocking the cold interaction I'd just had. But the mental weight of it was suffocating. Every time I checked my side mirrors, I half expected to see that white SUV roaring up behind me again. A ghost of pure, unadulterated entitlement. My hands would have stopped gripping the wheel, just a little too tight, my knuckles staying a ghostly white until I consciously forced myself to relax. You don't realize how much a 30-second interaction can rattle your core until you're responsible for the most vulnerable members of society. I kept thinking about Mrs. Gable. To that woman in the SUV, Mrs. Gable was just a delay. She was a biological obstacle. But to me, she's a person who once taught third grade for 35 years. She's a woman who lost her husband to cancer in the 90s and still wears her wedding ring on a silver chain around her neck because her fingers got too thin to hold it. When you know someone's story, you can't just see them as a slow walker. You see the effort it takes for them to simply exist in a world that's trying to leave them behind. I pulled into a quiet suburban cul-de-sac to pick up my next client, a man named Mr. Eris. Now, Mr. Eris is the polar opposite of Mrs. Gable. Where she is soft and retreating, Mr. Eris is a retired construction foreman who still thinks he's in charge of every site he steps onto. He has early-stage vascular dementia, which means he's mostly there, but his temper can flare up, and his sense of time is completely warped. "You're late," he barked as I climbed out to help him. I checked my watch. I was actually 3 minutes early. "Sorry about that, Mr. Eris. Traffic was a bit of a nightmare this morning." "People don't know how to drive anymore," he grumbled, leaning heavily on his four-pronged cane as we made our way to the van. "In my day, you followed the rules or you got off the road. Simple as that." I couldn't help but let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You have no idea, Mr. Eris. You have no idea." As I helped him into his seat and double-checked his belt, I found myself looking at his weathered hands. They were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who spent his life building things. Roads, bridges, houses. He contributed to the very infrastructure that woman in the SUV was currently abusing. There's a profound irony in that. We spend our youth building a world for the next generation, only to have that generation treat us like garbage because we're in the way of the very things we built for them. The drive to the dialysis center with Mr. Aris was a study in patience. He wanted the radio off. Then he wanted it on. Then he wanted the window down, then up. Usually, I'd find this a bit taxing, but today I welcomed it. His demands were human. They were grounded in a desire for comfort and a lingering need for control in a life where he was losing so much of it. It was a far cry from the irrational, dehumanizing rage I'd encountered earlier, but the image of that SUV bucking over the speed bump kept flashing in my mind like a strobe light. I kept analyzing it, trying to find a grain of logic. Was she having a medical emergency? No, if she were, she would have been looking for help, not throwing "what are you doing" gestures at a transport driver. Was she late for something life-altering? Even if she were, does being late justify potentially killing an 80-year-old woman? The answer is always no. But in our modern world, the no is getting quieter, and the me is getting louder. We live in this age of instant gratification. We want our food in 10 minutes, our packages in 24 hours, and our roads to be empty except for us. When that reality is challenged, even by something as noble as a medical transport van helping a person with dementia, some people snap. They see the van not as a service, but as a personal affront, a glitch in their simulation. As I sat in the parking lot of the dialysis center, waiting for Mr. Ayres to be checked in, I pulled out my phone. I wanted to see if anyone else had reported a white SUV driving like a lunatic in the area. I scrolled through a local community group, and sure enough, there were a few posts about a white Cadillac weaving through traffic near the medical district. People were complaining about her nearly hitting a cyclist and blowing through a red light near the elementary school. It hit me then. This wasn't just a moment of frustration. This was a pattern. This was a person who felt completely detached from the consequences of her actions. I looked back at my empty van. I thought about the normal spot at the dementia center. I thought about the design of that driveway. It's a bottleneck by design, a place that requires a social contract of, I'll wait for you and you'll wait for me. Without that contract, the whole system collapses into chaos. I began to feel a different kind of anger. It wasn't the hot, reactionary anger I'd felt when she was revving her engine behind me. It was a cold, protective anger. I'm the one who sees the bruises on these seniors when they fall. I'm the one who hears them cry when they realize they can't remember their children's names. I'm the one who holds their hands when the world becomes too loud and too fast for them. And I'll be damned if I let someone like her make them feel like they don't belong in public. I decided right then that I wasn't going to just let it go. Not because I wanted revenge, but because people like that rely on the silence of others. They count on the fact that you'll be too stunned, too professional, or too busy to do anything about it. They thrive in the vacuum of accountability. I reached for my clipboard and started writing down every detail I could remember. The make, the model, the approximate year. I didn't get the full plate, but I had enough. I had the time, the location, and a van full of witnesses. Even if some of them wouldn't be able to testify in a traditional sense, I knew what they had felt. I knew the terror in Mrs. Gable's eyes. I spent the rest of my shift on high alert. Every time I approached the dementia center for my afternoon pickups, I scanned the horizon. I found myself taking the corners even slower, being even more deliberate with the ramp, as if I were daring the world to try and rush me again. When I finally returned to the center to pick up Mrs. Gable at the end of her session, the air had cooled significantly. The sun was low, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. I pulled into the same secondary spot, my heart doing a little nervous skip. The normal spot was empty this time. I saw Mrs. Gable coming through the glass doors, escorted by a young nurse named Sarah. Mrs. Gable looked tired. The program is good for them, but it's exhausting. She saw my van and a small, genuine smile broke across her face. "There's my ride," she said softly. As I helped her toward the ramp, Sarah leaned in and whispered, "Hey, did you have a run-in this morning? Mrs. Gable was really agitated when she first got here. Kept talking about a big white monster in the driveway." My stomach dropped. A big white monster. That's how she had processed the SUV. Not as a car, not as a person, but as a predatory force. "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. "We had a bit of an issue. A lady in an SUV didn't want to wait 30 seconds for the ramp." Sarah sighed, a look of weary recognition crossing her face. "It's getting worse. Last week we had someone honking at a man in a walker because he wasn't crossing the crosswalk fast enough. I don't know what's wrong with people." I looked at Mrs. Gable, who was now safely tucked into her seat, clutching her peppermint-scented handbag. She looked so small, so utterly defenseless.
"I know what's wrong," I said. "They've forgotten that they're going to be in this seat one day too."
The drive back to Mrs. Gable's assisted living facility was quieter than usual. The afternoon sun was hanging low, casting long, golden fingers across the dashboard, but the warmth didn't reach me. Usually, we'd have the local soft rock station playing low, and she'd hum along to something by James Taylor or Carole King. But today, she just sat there, staring out the window, her small frame looking even more diminished in the large passenger seat. "The monster is gone, isn't it?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was barely a whisper, thin and reedy, like a dry leaf skittering across pavement. I caught her eye in the rearview mirror. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. "Yes, Mrs. Gable, the monster is long gone. It's just us now. You're safe." "It was so loud," she said, her fingers twisting the strap of her handbag, like it wanted to swallow the van. I didn't know where to go. That was the moment it really settled in for me. We talk about road rage as if it's a victimless crime of passion, a temporary lapse in judgment that ends once the cars pull apart. But for someone like Mrs. Gable, that 30-second burst of adrenaline-fueled entitlement wasn't just a nuisance. It was a trauma. It was a sensory assault that her brain, already struggling to map out the world, couldn't categorize as anything other than a threat to her life. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so hard, my wrists started to ache. I've been doing this job for 5 years. I've seen it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But there's a specific kind of ugliness that comes from targeting the weak, because you're in a hurry to get to a Starbucks or a hair appointment. I started thinking about my own grandmother. She'd been gone for nearly a decade, but she was the reason I started driving these vans in the first place. She'd lost her license when her eyesight started to fail, and I remember the look of sheer, crushing defeat on her face when she realized she could no longer get herself to the grocery store. To her, that van wasn't just a vehicle. It was her dignity. It was her last shred of independence. If I had been there that morning and seen someone treat my grandmother like a biological obstacle, I don't think I would have stayed as professional as I did today. And that's the thing. Every person in the back of my van is someone's someone. They are mothers, fathers, veterans, teachers. They've lived entire lifetimes of struggle and joy, and now, in their twilight years, they're being treated like garbage by people who can't spare 30 seconds of their precious day. As I pulled up to Mrs. Gable's facility and walked her inside, I made sure to hold her hand a little tighter. I waited until I saw her safely tucked into her favorite armchair in the common room before I headed back out to the van. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine idling, watching the sky turn a bruised shade of purple. I pulled out my phone again. I had the notes I'd written down earlier. I felt this burning need to do something. But what? Call the police? "Officer, a woman was mean to me in a parking lot." They'd laugh and hang up. They have bigger fish to fry. But then I remembered the way she'd hit that speed bump. The way she'd nearly clipped that sedan at the exit. That wasn't just mean. That was reckless endangerment. I decided to call my supervisor, Mike. Mike's a retired cop himself, a big, burly guy with a heart of gold and a zero-tolerance policy for anyone messing with his seniors. "Mike," I said when he picked up, "we had a situation today at the dementia center." I told him the whole story. I told him about the revving engine, the gestures, the way she nearly jumped the curb while Mrs. Gable was halfway out the door. I described the high-speed exit and the near miss at the stop sign. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Mike's heavy breathing, the sound of a man who was clearly trying to keep his own temper in check. "Did you get the plate?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Partial," I said. "And I know the make and model. White Cadillac SUV, newer model. Probably a 2022 or 2023. She's a regular at that facility, Mike. She was in the drop-off spot before me." "A regular," Mike repeated. "So she's likely dropping off a family member, someone in the same boat as our clients." That realization hit me like a physical blow. She was there for the same reason I was. She was there to care for someone.
And yet, she had zero empathy for the person standing right in front of her. How do you live in that kind of irony? How do you love someone enough to bring them to a care center, but hate the rest of the world enough to put them in danger?
"I'm going to call the facility manager," Mike said. "They have cameras in that loop. If we can get a clear shot of her plate and her face, I'm taking it to the precinct. I don't care if it's just a traffic dispute. That's reckless driving in a high pedestrian zone. She's going to learn that 30 seconds of patience is a hell of a lot cheaper than a lawyer." I felt a small sense of relief, but it was overshadowed by a lingering bitterness. Even if she got a ticket, even if she got a stern talking to from a cop, would it change her? Would it make her see Mrs. Gable as a person next time? I started my drive back to the depot, the city lights beginning to flicker on around me. The evening rush hour was starting, and the aggression on the road was ramping up. I saw a guy in a sports car weaving through lanes without a blinker. I saw a woman on her phone, drifting dangerously close to a cyclist. It felt like I was seeing the world through a different lens now. We're also disconnected. We sit in these armored metal boxes, insulated from the world by glass and steel and climate control. And we forget that everyone else on the road is a human being. We've turned driving into a video game where the goal is to get to the finish line first, and anyone else is just an NPC, a non-player character, meant to be bypassed or ignored. But there are no NPCs in real life. I thought about the big white monster again. To that woman, I was just a slow-moving obstacle. To her, Mrs. Gable was just a delay. But to me, that woman was the real obstacle. She was the obstacle to a kinder, safer world. She was the personification of the me-first attitude that's slowly eroding our sense of community. When I finally pulled the van into the lot at the end of my shift, I did my final walkthrough. I checked the seats for forgotten sweaters or hats. I swept the floor. I wiped down the handrails. I found a small peppermint-scented candy wrapper tucked into the crack of the seat where Mrs. Gable had been sitting. I picked it up and held it in my palm for a second. It was so small, so insignificant, but it was a reminder of the life I'm paid to protect. As I walked toward my own car to head home, I saw Mike standing by the office door, his arms crossed over his chest. He gave me a somber nod. "Manager at the center called back," he said. "They got her on high-def video, everything you said, and then some. She actually clipped one of the orange safety cones on her way out and just kept going." "And?" I asked. "And they know exactly who she is. She's the daughter of one of their new residents. Apparently, she's been a problem since the day they signed the paperwork. Always complaining about the staff, always in a rush, always acting like the world owes her a favor for taking care of her own father." My heart sank. So it wasn't just a bad day. It was a personality. "The manager is banning her from the drop-off loop," Mike continued. "From now on, she has to park in the main lot and walk her father in. And I've already sent the footage over to my buddy in traffic. He's very interested in that near miss at the exit." I should have felt victorious. I should have been happy that justice was being served. But all I could think about was the father. If that's how she treats strangers and professional drivers in public, how does she treat an old man who can't remember his own name behind closed doors? The news about the ban should have felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. But instead, it felt like a cold stone settling in the pit of my stomach. I spent that night tossing and turning, the blue light of the street lamps outside my window reflecting off the walls in a way that reminded me of the emergency lights on my van. I kept seeing the father in my mind, a man I hadn't even met yet. I imagined him sitting in the passenger seat of that white Cadillac, gripped by the same terror Mrs. Gable had felt, while his own daughter used the vehicle like a weapon. How do you get to that point? How does the person who used to hold your hand while you cross the street become a burden that you're willing to risk lives to get rid of for 8 hours a day? It's a question that haunts anyone who works in elderly care. We see the best of humanity, the sons who visit every single day to read the newspaper to a father who doesn't recognize them, and we see the absolute worst. We see the monsters. The next morning, I arrived at the depot earlier than usual. I wanted to be the one to drive the route that passed the dementia center. I wanted to see if the ban was being enforced. I wanted to see if the world was holding its line. Mike was already in the office, a lukewarm cup of coffee in his hand and a stack of incident reports on his desk. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. "The police paid her a visit last night," he said without looking up. My heart jumped. "And?" "Standard stuff. A warning for reckless driving, a stern lecture about the safety of the residents. But here's the kicker." Mike finally looked at me, his eyes hard. "She tried to blame you. She told the officer that the van driver was intentionally blocking her in and that she felt threatened. She actually tried to play the victim." I felt a surge of pure hot adrenaline. Threatened? I was the one holding the hand of a 90-pound woman who can barely stand. I was the one with the high-visibility vest and the flashing hazards. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It's a classic tactic of the entitled. When they get caught, they don't apologize. They weaponize their own behavior and project it onto you. "The footage doesn't lie, though," Mike added, a grim smile touching his lips. "The officer told her that if he saw her within a block of that facility driving like that again, he'd impound the car on the spot. And the facility manager? She's a spitfire. She told the daughter that if she so much as raises her voice to a staff member or a driver again, they'll terminate her father's contract." That part hurt to hear. Terminating the contract meant the father would lose his spot in the program. He'd be stuck at home with a woman who clearly didn't have the patience to handle him. It was a catch-22. To protect the group, the individual might have to suffer. I headed out for my morning rounds, the familiar hum of the van's engine acting as a sort of white noise for my racing thoughts. My first stop was Mrs. Gable. I was nervous about seeing her. I didn't want the big white monster to be the only thing she remembered about our time together. When I pulled up to her assisted living home, she was waiting by the door. She looked a little more put together today, a bright floral scarf around her neck and a bit of pink lipstick on. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," I said, keeping my voice as light and cheerful as I could manage. "Ready for another day?" She looked at the van, then looked at me. For a second, I saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She was scanning the street. She was looking for the SUV. "Is it safe today?" she asked. I walked over to her and offered my arm. "It's very safe. I've got my eyes on everything. Nobody's going to bother us today." She took my arm, her grip surprisingly firm. As we walked to the van, she leaned in and whispered, "I don't like the monsters, dear. They make my head hurt." "I don't like them either, Mrs. Gable, but they aren't allowed here anymore." The drop-off at the center was a completely different experience that morning. The normal spot was occupied by a transport van from a different company. I pulled into my secondary spot, turned on my hazards, and deployed the ramp. I felt a sense of hyper-awareness, my eyes darting to every white car that turned into the driveway. But the Cadillac wasn't there. Instead, I saw a man walking toward the entrance from the far end of the parking lot. He was stooped over, his gait heavy and uncertain. He was being led, almost dragged, by a woman in a sharp business suit. Even from 50 yards away, I recognized the aggressive tilt of her head. It was her. She was walking so fast the old man was stumbling, his orthopedic shoes catching on the uneven pavement. She didn't look back at him. She didn't offer a steadying hand. She just gripped his elbow and marched him toward the door like she was disposing of a bag of trash. I watched them, my hand resting on the side of my van. My blood was simmering, but I stayed quiet. I stayed professional. I focused on Mrs. Gable. I made sure her exit was slow, steady, and dignified. I made sure she felt like the most important person in the world for those 30 seconds. As I was retracting the ramp, the woman came back out of the center. She had dropped her father off and was heading back to her car. She had to pass right by me. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her jaw set in a hard, angry line. But as she got level with my driver's side door, she muttered something under her breath. "Pathetic," she hissed. I stopped. My hand was on the door handle. I could have let it go. I should have let it go. But I thought about Mrs. Gable's big white monster. I thought about the man she had just dragged across the parking lot. "Ma'am," I said. My voice was calm, but it had an edge like a razor blade. She stopped and turned, her eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and venom. "What?" "I hope," I said, looking her right in the eye, "that when you're his age, the person driving you is more patient than you are. Because 30 seconds is a very short time until it's all you have left." Her face went pale, then a deep, mottled purple. She looked like she wanted to scream, to launch into another theatrical display of, "What are you doing?" But she remembered the police warning. She remembered the facility manager's threat. She didn't say a word. She just turned on her heel and stomped toward her Cadillac, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement. I watched her get in. I watched her start the engine. I waited for her to rev it, to peel out, to show some sign of the monster I'd seen the day before. But she didn't. She sat there for a long time. Maybe it was the shock of being confronted. Maybe, just maybe, a tiny sliver of what I said had managed to pierce through that thick armor of entitlement. She pulled out of the parking lot slowly. She stopped at the stop sign. She hit the speed bump at 5 miles per hour. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I just felt a profound sadness. The rest of the day was a blur of the usual routines, but the atmosphere had shifted. I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I realized that my job isn't just about the driving or the logistics. It's about being a witness. It's about standing up for the people who have lost their voices. Later that afternoon, I was back at the center for the final pickup. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised gold. I saw the father, the man from the Cadillac, sitting on a bench by the door, waiting for his daughter to come back and get him. He looked lonely. He looked like he was drifting in a sea of forgotten memories, waiting for a lighthouse that was more interested in its own schedule than in guiding him home. I walked over to him. "Good afternoon, sir," I said gently. He looked up at me, his eyes clouded but kind. "Is it time to go?" "Not quite yet," I said, "but it will be soon. You just sit tight." "Thank you," he whispered. "Everyone is in such a hurry these days. I can't quite keep up." "You don't have to keep up, sir," I told him. "The world can wait 30 seconds for you. It really can." As I walked back to my van, I looked at the normal drop-off spot. It was empty. The driveway was quiet. The monster had been tamed, at least for now. But I knew there were more out there. Thousands of them, gripped by the same frantic, selfish energy, tearing through the lives of the people I care for. I realized then that the fight for empathy is a daily one. It's fought in the small moments, the 30 seconds at a curb, the hand held a little longer, the refusal to be intimidated by a revving engine. I stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle in the parking lot after the white Cadillac finally crept away. It was a strange victory, one that didn't feel like winning at all. It felt like I had just put a temporary patch on a much larger, much deeper wound in our society. That woman wasn't an anomaly. She was a symptom. And as I climbed back into the driver's seat of my van, the familiar smell of antiseptic wipes and Mrs. Gable's peppermint lingering in the air, I found myself thinking back to why I started doing this job in the first place. You don't get into medical transport for the paycheck. It's grueling, the hours are unpredictable, and you're constantly dealing with the heavy reality of human decline. But for me, it's always been about a man named Mr. Sterling. This was years ago, back when I was just starting out and still had that nervous energy about the lift and the straps. Mr. Sterling was a World War II veteran, a man who had survived some of the most harrowing moments in human history, only to be sidelined by a stroke that took his speech and most of his mobility. I remember one afternoon, similar to the one I'd just had, where the world felt like it was moving at 1,000 miles an hour, and I was the only thing standing still. I was trying to get Mr. Sterling into the van outside a busy pharmacy. It was raining, one of those cold, needle-like rains that chills you to the bone. The ramp was acting up, the sidewalk was slick, and a line of cars was forming behind me. People were honking. One guy in a delivery truck actually leaned out his window and screamed, "Move the damn bucket of bolts." I was panicking. I was rushing. I was making mistakes. I accidentally bumped Mr. Sterling's foot against the frame of the door, and I saw him wince. I felt like a failure. I felt like that delivery driver was right. I was just an obstacle. But then Mr. Sterling reached out with the one hand he could still move. He grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, a remnant of the man who had once hauled heavy artillery across European mud. He looked me right in the eyes, and even though he couldn't speak, his gaze said everything. It said, "Slow down. I am still here. This moment matters." I stopped. I ignored the honking. I ignored the rain. I took a deep breath, reset the ramp, and moved him with the care and precision he deserved. When he was finally buckled in, I looked at the delivery truck driver in my mirror. I didn't get angry. I just felt a profound sense of pity for him. He was so busy trying to get to his next stop that he was willing to trample over a hero just to save 2 minutes. That was the day I realized that my van isn't just a vehicle. It's a sanctuary. It's a place where time has to behave differently. And as I drove away from the dementia center now, years later, I realized that the woman in the Cadillac was just like that delivery driver. She was trapped in the now, unable to see the always. I decided to take the long way back to the depot. I needed the time to decompress, to let the adrenaline of the confrontation wash away. I drove through the older part of town, where the trees are tall and the houses have wide front porches. I saw people sitting out, watching the world go by. I saw a kid learning to ride a bike, his father running alongside him, hands hovering just inches from the seat. It's all the same thing, isn't it? The father's hands, my hands on the ramp, the nurse's hand on Mrs. Gable's elbow. We spend our lives being caught by others, and yet we're so quick to let go when we're the ones doing the catching. When I got back to the depot, Mike was still there, closing up the shop. He saw me pulling in and walked over, leaning against the side of the van as I stepped out. "You look like you've been through a war," he said, handing me a fresh bottle of water. "Just a skirmish," I replied, taking a long pull of the water. I saw her again. The Cadillac lady. Mike's eyebrow shot up. "And? Did you try anything?" "No. She was walking her father in from the back of the lot. She looked miserable, but she wasn't speeding." I paused, thinking about the look on her face when I mentioned her own future. "I think I might have actually gotten through to her, Mike. Or maybe I just scared her. I can't tell the difference anymore." Mike sighed, looking out over the fleet of vans. "In this job, sometimes the best you can do is hold the line. You can't change people's hearts overnight, but you can make sure they don't break anyone else's while they're figuring it out." He was right. We aren't just drivers. We're the keepers of the pace. We're the ones who insist that the world slows down for the people who can't keep up. And as I handed Mike my keys and headed toward my own car, I felt a strange sense of pride. That woman in the Cadillac might never be my friend. She might always harbor a resentment for the van driver who stood up to her. But tomorrow morning, when I pull into that loop and Mrs. Gable is waiting for me, I know it's going to be a little bit quieter. The monster has been pushed back into the shadows, and for 30 seconds, the world will be exactly as it should be: patient, kind, and still. I sat in my own car for a moment before starting the engine. I looked at the dashboard, at the clock ticking away. I thought about how easy it is to fall into that trap, to feel the pressure of the minutes, the weight of the schedule. I made a silent promise to myself right then. I wasn't going to let the world's hurry infect me. I was going to carry that 30-second piece with me, even when I wasn't on the clock. Because at the end of the day, we're all just passengers. We're all just waiting for someone to open the door, deploy the ramp, and tell us that we have all the time in the world. What about you? Have you ever witnessed someone lose their mind over a minor delay, especially when it involved someone who couldn't help it? Or maybe you've been on the other side, feeling the pressure of the world pushing you to be faster, meaner, more efficient? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. We see a lot of things on the road, and sometimes
Sharing these stories is the only way to remind each other that humanity still matters.
If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. We've got plenty more experiences to share from the front lines of the quietest jobs in the world.